Okay, we'd like to turn to the book of Exodus, chapter 3, and also chapter 33. I'll read one verse in each of these chapters. Exodus 3, verse 6. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Exodus 33, verse 18. This is Moses speaking. And he said, I beseech thee, show me thy glory. Both of these verses involve the Lord and Moses. They speak of a response of Moses toward the Lord. There is quite a contrast between chapter 3, verse 6, where we read, And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. You contrast that with Exodus 33:16. I beseech thee, show me thy glory. So our question is what brought Moses from hiding his face out of fear and asking God to show his face, basically, to show him his glory? What is it that spans between these two statements? Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And I beseech thee, show me thy glory. Someone might say, well, they were different circumstances. That's true. But this is something more than just a difference in circumstances. I believe it involves a growth in knowledge and relationship with the Lord on the part of Moses. So our subject this morning is the journey from fear of God to intimate knowledge of God. To know God by way of personal relationship revolutionizes lives. You can't know God in a personal relationship and not have your life affected. It's going to impact your life. And if we're going to serve Him in a way that will honor Him, we must know Him in a deep and abiding way. So let's go back to Exodus 3, where we see Moses at the burning bush. Exodus 3 opens with Moses at the backside of the desert. What is he doing? He is shepherding a flock that belongs to a man named Jethro. God is, unbeknownst to Moses, God is preparing and training Moses for his service. God's people are suffering as a result of Egyptian bondage, and God has a very important work for Moses to do, to lead His people out of bondage. And Moses, though educated in Pharaoh's court, we read in Acts 7, verse 22, And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, which is the wisdom of the world. And he was also a very impressive individual. We read again in Acts 7:22, and was mighty in words and deeds. But these are not the things that equipped Moses for the work that God would have him to do. So there is Moses at the backside of the desert, fulfilling the duties of a shepherd. This is part of him being prepared for God's work. Not only on the backside of the desert, but notice more specifically, it says that he came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. Now Horeb is the name of the mountain range, and the mountain of God is Sinai, a particular peak in that range. Throughout the Old Testament, this is a place of God's revelation. It is a place of God's sanctification, a place of peace, a place of power. Moses is leading the flock in this area. And as he does so, something miraculous happens. There in verse 2, and the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. This would change his life. What happened that day would change his life. The angel of the Lord appeared unto him. Now I believe that's Jesus Christ by way of theophany. He appeared in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. Moses turns to look at the burning bush. A bush on fire, but it is not consumed. In verse 4, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush. So you turn, you look at this bush. It's on fire, but it's not being destroyed. And out of the midst of the bush, there's a voice. And again, God called him out of the midst of the bush. There's the reason the bush is not consumed, because God's in it. God was in the midst, and he said, Moses, Moses. And the response of Moses, and he said, here am I. That is, Moses was ready to hear what God had to say. Moses is then instructed in verse 5 not to draw any closer and to put off his shoes from his feet. He must put off the shoes of everyday walk in life. That's how we're to enter the house of God as well. Not literally taking our shoes off, but we're to be removed from everyday walk in life. The reason for the place whereon thou standest is holy. It is sacred. It is sanctified ground. And it was here that God called Moses to do what he would have him to do. And it was here that Moses saw and experienced something that would alter his life and control his life, and would have a lifelong impression upon him. He spoke of such at the end of his life. In Deuteronomy 33 and 16, he said, the goodwill of him that dwelt in the bush. The goodwill of him that dwelt in the bush. This is the end of Moses' life. He never forgot that burning bush. And then God goes on and reveals, in verse 6, reveals himself to Moses. He said, I am the God of thy father. That is, God is showing him that he's not just an ancient God, but he's the living God who knows his needs, his cares, and his concerns. He said, I am the God of Abraham. Now, each one of these is a message in itself. I am the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Again, he could have said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But that's not how it's written. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So God stands revealed before Moses as the covenant-keeping God, the God of grace. And then we read, Moses hid his face. Why? For he was afraid to look upon God. Notice in Acts 7, keep a mark there and go to Acts chapter 7. Stephen recalling this. Acts 7, verse 31 and 32. We've already made reference to Acts 7:22. This has to do with Moses' fear. When Moses saw it, he wondered at the sight, and as he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Lord came unto him, saying, I am the God of thy fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then Moses trembled. So Moses hid his face, for he was afraid. So there is Moses before God, and Stephen says he trembled and durst not behold. That is, he hid his face. He couldn't look. The thought that God was there filled him with fear. And then if you go back to Exodus 3, God assures Moses. He's reassuring Moses. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters. For I know their sorrows. In verse 8, and I am come down to deliver them. In other words, Moses, no need to fear. Remember, Moses has killed an Egyptian. Perhaps he's feeling guilty. Perhaps that's one of his reasons for fear. But God assures him, I'm come down. And he's come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and bring them out of that land unto a good land. So God reassures Moses. Verse 10, there's an invitation to Moses. Come now, therefore. Come, Moses. Come now. Come now. Again, he's dealing with Moses in his fear. And then God reveals his will for Moses. I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. In verse 11, keep in mind, Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Verse 11, Moses said unto God, he's fearful. Who am I? So he offers up a reason why he can't do what God has told him to do. And in verse 12, God responds, certainly I will. Moses, get your eyes off yourself. I will. I will. So he offers up excuse. God responds with himself. In verse 13, Moses raises a question. And then in verse 14, God responds with himself. I am that I am. He is saying, Moses, I am who I am. And that's not going to change. And I will. And with that in mind, God continued to instruct Moses concerning his will for him. And in chapter 4, verse 1, Moses again offers up an objection, and God proceeds to show Moses His power. God always responds with Himself. And in verse 10, Moses offers yet another excuse. And in verses 11 and 12, God again turns His attention to Himself. And then notice verses 18 through 20 of chapter 4. And Moses went and returned to Jethro his father-in-law, and said unto him, Let me go, I pray thee, and return unto my brethren which are in Egypt, and see whether they be yet alive. And Jethro said to Moses, Go in peace. And the Lord said unto Moses in Midian, Go, return into Egypt, for all the men that are dead which sought thy life. And Moses took his wife and his sons, and set them upon an ass, and he returned to the land of Egypt, and Moses took the rod of God in his hand. Moses now feels compelled to follow the Lord. From this point on would be an incredible adventure with God. In chapter 3, verse 6, there was on Moses' part a fear of the Lord. And though you and I are to fear the Lord, if we're going to serve God in a way that honors Him, there must be more than just a fear of God. You have to, again, we're to have a fear of God. But that can't be all. There has to be more. And there are people who have a fear of God, and the reason they do everything they do is because they're afraid God's going to do such and such if they don't. You've got to get beyond that. That's not how you and I are to serve God. So in between Exodus 3 verse 6 and Exodus 33:18, I want to show you that there was growth on the part of Moses. So in between our text verses, God continually reminded Moses over and over and over that He was God. And as God, He would. We see it, well, just notice in Exodus 3, verse 10, I will send thee unto Pharaoh. Verse 12, certainly I will. Verse 17, I will. Verse 20, I will. I will. Verse 21, I will. And this continues all the way up to Exodus 33. It is being planted in the heart of Moses that God is absolute sovereign. That God is absolutely dependable. It's being ingrained in Moses. If Moses is going to truly serve God, the truths of I am the Lord and I will must be rooted in his being. In chapter 5, following the Lord's leading, Moses and Aaron go unto Pharaoh, and they say, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go. And the result was that the Egyptian taskmasters increased the workload of the Israelites. Wasn't the result they were hoping for. In Exodus 6, verse 1, Then the Lord said unto Moses, God's talking to Moses, Now shalt thou personally see what I will do. You will personally see what I will do to Pharaoh. In verse 2, and God spoke unto Moses and said unto him, I am the Lord. Notice chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. Wherefore, say unto the children of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will rid you out of their bondage, and I will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments, and I will take you to me for a people, and I will be to you a God, and ye shall know that I am the Lord your God, which bringeth you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you unto the land concerning the which I did swear to give it to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it to you for an heritage. I am the Lord. So it is being ingrained in Moses. I am the Lord. I am in control. And I will. And if we are going to properly serve God, it has to be ingrained in us. He is God, and He will. He is God, He is faithful, and He will do what He said He would do. And then notice in chapter 7, verse 2, Thou shalt speak all that I command thee, and thy brothers shall speak unto Pharaoh, that he send the children of Israel out of his land. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt, speaking of the plagues. But Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you. He's not going to listen to you, and there's a God reason for it. Moses, don't get discouraged when Pharaoh doesn't listen. I'm in control, and there's a God reason why he won't listen. That I may lay my hand upon Egypt, and bring forth mine armies and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. So God would send 10 plagues upon Egypt. And these would be a manifestation of God's sovereignty. A manifestation of God's absolute control over all. An absolute display of His power. Not only to Egypt, but also to the Israelites, and also unto Moses. Again, God is preparing and training Moses that God is God. That He is who He says He is. This is being ingrained in Moses. The 10 plagues are recorded in chapters 7 through 12. And in those chapters, we read, the Lord spake unto Moses, and we read, and the Lord said unto Moses 19 times. 19 times God is speaking to Moses during these plagues. A relationship is being further developed between God and Moses. And with these plagues, it is being ingrained in Moses that God is God. That God will do what He says He will do. And with these plagues, we see that God, the message is God takes care of His people. And God is sovereign and almighty. Moses is getting more and more familiar with the voice of God. And God said unto Moses, and God spake unto Moses. And he's learning more and more about the person of God. Eventually, Pharaoh lets the people go. And God, in Exodus 13, verses 18 through 22, leads the Israelites by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And Moses is learning of God's faithful leading. Moses is being taught. Trust God. Trust God. Again, we're going from Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And God's teaching him, trust me. Chapter 14, they're before the Red Sea. And in verse 1, and the Lord spake unto Moses. So there they are, in a dilemma. And the Lord spake unto Moses. We read the same thing in verse 4. The Lord spake unto Moses. We read again verse 14. In other words, we hear God say in those verses, I will. I will. Verses 10 and 11, the people in fear accuse and blame Moses. But notice, Moses' knowledge of God has grown. Notice verse 13 and 14. And Moses said unto the people, fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Here's a man that is not just fearing God. It's something more. A relationship is being developed. Trust is being strengthened, which will show you to you today. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more. The Lord shall. Over and over Moses has been told, I will, I will. And now Moses stands before the people and says, the Lord shall. So his trust is being strengthened. His knowledge of God has grown. As a result, there's confidence in God. Notice in verses 21 and 22. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night. And this was ingrained in Moses. He sees the power of God. He never got away from it. In Exodus 15, Moses and the children of Israel are singing unto the Lord. Verse 22, they go 3 days in the wilderness without water. And they, in verse 23, they arrive in Marah. And there's water there, but it's poison. And we read the people murmured against Moses. But notice verse 15. Verse 25. And he cried unto the Lord. Here was a man who hid his face from God, for he was afraid. But he's moved beyond that. A relationship has been established. Moses has truths ingrained in him concerning God. Moses' trust has grown. And he cried unto the Lord. And the Lord showed him a tree. Moses, having grown in the knowledge of God and relationship to God, turns to God. And the Lord showed him. So it is today. God miraculously would make the waters drinkable, further ingraining in Moses, God can. God can. Chapter 16, verse 2, we read, and the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron. And they began to hurl false and ridiculous accusations toward them. But notice verse 4. Then said the Lord unto Moses, behold, I will. There it is again. I will. I will rain bread from heaven for you. And the people should go out and gather a certain rate every day. The truth of God's provision is being ingrained in Moses. In Acts 17, verses 1 through 3, the people again have no water. And again they murmur. against Moses, bringing accusations against him. And in Exodus 17, verse 4, and Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, what shall I do? Moses cried unto the Lord, show me what to do. This is due to a personal relationship, personal knowledge and trust in the Lord. Verse 5, and the Lord said unto Moses. God instructed him, and God would provide water from a rock. And again, miraculous provision. Streams in the desert. And Moses is growing. Moses is growing in his knowledge of God. Also in Exodus 17, Amalek comes against Israel. And again, Moses prays. He's on top of the mountain praying. And there's Aaron and Hur holding up his hands. And God brings victory. And we read in verse 15, Moses built an altar. Exodus 3 verse 6, Moses hid his face from God, for he was afraid. And now we come, Moses built an altar. With his advancing knowledge of God and growing relationship, Moses worships God. And he called the name of it Jehovah Nissi, the Lord our banner. Again, Moses is growing in his knowledge of God. He's growing in his relationship with God. In chapter 19, Moses is with God upon the mountain. And God spoke to Moses. Chapter 20. Notice verse 2. I am the Lord, thy God. That's been ingrained in Moses, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. He reminds Moses, I am Redeemer God. And then he proceeded to state law after law. Moses is learning. Redeemer God has boundaries. Redeemer God has rules. Moses is further learning, and it is being ingrained in him that God is the authority. Moses also was given precise instructions concerning the tabernacle. And Moses is further learning, and it's being ingrained in him that God's ways are strict and precise. And all must be done God's way. It's got to be God's will, God's way. Not God's will, my way. Not God's will, your way. God's will, God's way. A lot of people, well, whatever God's will is, but it's God's will according to them. No, it's God's will, God's way. And Moses is learning this with the instruction of the tabernacle. God's will, God's way. Chapter 33, verse 9. Moses enters the tabernacle. Moses entered into the tabernacle. The cloudy pillar descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle. And the Lord talked with Moses. Quite a change. Moses hid his face, for he was afraid. Moses has learned so much about God. It's been ingrained in his soul. And the Lord talked with Moses. And notice verse 11. And the Lord spake unto Moses face to face. Oh, what a time Moses had in that tabernacle. The Lord talked with Moses face to face. Oh, what a difference from Moses hid his face, for he was afraid, to look upon God. Then notice verse 13 and 14. Now therefore, this is Moses, I pray thee, if I have found grace in thy sight, show me now thy way. Thy way. Moses has learned about grace. Moses has learned about grace. That I may know thee. Show me now thy way. Notice, that I may know thee. He wants to know God more. Show me your will, that I might know you. That I may find grace in thy sight, and consider that this nation is thy people. And he said, this is God, my presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. Moses is assured of the grace of God. Verse 17, and the Lord said unto Moses, I will do this thing also that thou hast spoken, for thou hast found grace in my sight, and I know thee by name. There's a relationship. You found grace. Moses is assured of the grace of God. Then notice verse 18. And he said, I beseech thee, show me thy glory. You see, this is in the context of grace. Show me thy glory. Back in Exodus 3 verse 6, God told Moses that basically he was being gracious. I come down to deliver. Moses didn't know anything about grace. But by the time you get here, Moses knows about grace. He's gone from trembling fear of God to he wants more of God. He wants more of God. Again, as we've said many times, the word glory is the Hebrew word kabod. And it means a weight. It conveys the idea of something that can be felt. Something that leaves an impression. Glory, the glory of God is who God is. It's the beauty and magnificence of the Lord displayed. And Moses is saying, show me who you are in a way that causes me to feel it. He's growing. He's growing in his knowledge, and he desires for God to exhibit himself, to make himself known, to display himself, to demonstrate, to reveal, to make visible in an obvious and plain way who he is. Show me thy glory. In chapter 34, verses 1 and 2, and the Lord said unto Moses, hew thee 2 tables of stone like unto the first, and I will write upon these tables the words that were in the first tables, which thou breakest. And be ready in the morning, and come up in the morning unto Mount Sinai, and present thyself to me. That's quite different than Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Present thyself there to me. God instructs Moses. Verses 5 through 7, God displays himself to Moses. And the result of all that is Exodus 34:8, and Moses made haste and bowed his head to the earth. Moses made haste. God showed him his glory. And Moses quickly and without delay bowed his head and worshiped God. There was an urgency, there was a passion, there was an enthusiasm. And bowed his head toward the earth in reverence and humility. Not just mere fear that God was going to destroy him. He's come to know grace. He bows his head in reverence, in humility. And it says, and he worshiped. He was compelled to acknowledge the worthiness of God. That's what we do when we worship. We acknowledge the worthiness of God. So Moses, through a growing knowledge of God and a deepening relationship with God, immediately worships God. He draws near. That's what we do when we worship. You don't draw away from. He draws near to God in submission, in praise, and in gratitude. So, from chapter 3, verse 6, Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Just think if that's where the story ended. But that's not where it ends. It ends up with, I beseech thee, show me thy glory. And again, don't misunderstand the message. We are to have a fear of God. But you need more than that. Just to be trembling before God all the time, that's not a very good life. You must have more. There must be a growing knowledge of God. There must be a deepening relationship with God. And you see that from Exodus 3 on. And such will result in a compulsion to bow before Him in worship. And such will make service to the Lord a joy. I've seen people, all my ministry, who serve God out of fear. They're miserable people. Well, I'm going to give my tithe and offering because if I don't, God will get it anyway. Do you hear yourself? That's a terrible, first of all, it's a terrible reason to do it. You're just doing it for yourself. Everything about it is wrong. Well, I better do this because if I don't, I'm afraid God's going to punish me. Well, He might. That's a terrible way to look at life. I got to do this because if I don't, God will take something away from me. Or God will give me a sickness. That's no way to live life. Moses trembled before God, but he developed from that point on in his knowledge of God and the grace of God. And life is so much more enjoyable when that is our perspective. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us in verse of song. Let's all stand and Ben will lead us in singing.